Welcome to this Open University webinar, Embracing a Changing Skills Landscape. I'm Martin Cousins and I'm hosting this panel discussion in which we'll be discussing the OU's Business Barometer report launched yesterday. This annual report has charted the UK skills landscape since 2017, and this year's edition is, of course, launched in a very different context. Our expert panel will discuss the key findings of the report, which is based on a survey of 1,000 businesses. They will share their thoughts on how employers can respond to challenges and build a workforce with the skills to help secure a successful recovery and a bright future. Let's meet our panel.
I'm the Commercial Director for the Open University, and I have overall responsibility for all the commercial activities for the university currently, especially with regards to employers and working with them to understand their challenges and to provide, really good learning solutions for delivery.
Hi, my name is Anthony MP. I am a serial entrepreneur. I have started and scaled a number of organisations in the private and not-for-profit sectors. I do a lot of work within the skills sector. I chair the National Skills Policy for the Federation of Small Business and chair the government's Apprenticeship Stakeholder Board. And so they have this very broad understanding of what's happening within the skills system. And I'm very honoured to have been invited to write this year's Business Barometer report at a time when there's huge amount of change and huge challenges to organisations and their use of skills.
Thank you. And Maria.
Hello, yes, good morning. My name is Maria Bell. I am the Managing Director at Mesomorphic. We are a growing software development company based in Shetland, and we started off back in 2015. The company was founded by Barnaby Mercer, and I came on board about 2016. Over the past 5 years, we've been growing a company together that takes pride in the software that we develop, and also we're passionate about putting Shetland on the map for digital economy.
Thank you. And Julia.
So hello, I'm Julie again, and I work for IBM. For the last 12, 13 years, I've been working to launch the careers of our early professionals. Particularly the last several years, I have led IBM's school leaver and apprenticeship programs. Recently, I've moved really to be in the heart of IBM's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in terms of supporting our local communities, job seekers, local entrepreneurs and businesses respond to the challenges faced by the pandemic in terms of the reskilling, the upskilling that they need to transform themselves. So right now I'm the Skills Build Reignite programme lead for IBM Europe.
Great, thank you. And thanks to our panel for participating in today's discussion. So today's webinar will be split into 3 parts. In the first part, we'll look at the key takeaway from this year's Business Barometer report. This will be followed by a look at how employers can support skills development in their organisations. And we'll end with a short Q&A session answering questions that have been submitted by the audience. So, Viren, I'd like to start by asking you to give us some background on the report and why it is important.
Sure, thanks, Martin. So, I think the report has been produced annually since 2017, so it's in its 4th year of inception, and it's really there to help businesses understand the skills landscape in their region, as part of the nation, also in the sector. And it should give government and policymakers some crucial insights into what's actually happening. It highlights really the costs of the skills gap in terms of recruitment fees, in terms of inflated salaries, and bringing in staff at lower levels than required. So, and what we've tried to do is put a spotlight on the number of organisations or businesses that are forward-thinking and proactive, like we have today with IBM with Julia and with Maria from Mesomorphic as well.
Great, thank you. Anthony, you've been closely involved with this year's report. Could you outline what it tells us about the impact of the pandemic on businesses?
Yeah, I mean, well, the report has huge reach across the United Kingdom. We surveyed over 1,000 senior business leaders across the full breadth of different sectors in the country, in every region and in every nation. And we also got some really, really valuable insights about the differences between large organisations and small organisations. So we've got this really comprehensive view of skills requirements and skill shortages and that impact of the pandemic for all types of organisations across the United Kingdom.
What has the pandemic experience been like for Mesomorphic?
We're quite fortunate we work in an industry where working from home is the norm, really. We do have an office, but at which we tend to have everybody in, but there's always been that flexibility to work from home whenever needed. So the impact there wasn't exactly, wasn't a huge impact there. And what we also did to help other organisations adjust to that working from home when they're not used to it, we actually released a series of blog posts.
Great, thank you. And Julia, what's the experience been at IBM?
Hiring, we've had to look at, the skill set that we need right now as an organisation. And as I said, because we're already a digital organisation, that I think we're having to focus on, where the hot skills are needed and really reskill and train the workforce and focus the workforce on those hot skills. That's, to be fair, that's about us. But for IBM, it's the impact on our clients has been phenomenal, and we're seeing a real change in priorities on spending. So they've in terms of spending on their digital transformations, it's accelerated because it had to, and the priorities of our client organisations has had to change, and as an organisation we've had to change our ways of working to support them to do that. From a hiring perspective, as with everybody, hiring has been put on hold, but we're still hiring. We're still hiring our apprentices and our interns and our graduates, because it's important to have that ongoing talent pipeline for any organisation, large or small. So yes, we can absolutely see the impact of the pandemic, on ourselves, but also very much so on our client population.
Are skill shortages an issue?
Yes, Martin, I think they actually are. I think the report shows that 56% of organisations are still experiencing skills shortages. I mean, it's down from last year, admittedly, but it's still quite significant. And in a couple of key areas, I think Julia mentions digital and the digital pivot. Digital skills are a big gap at the moment, and obviously, good leadership. And I think they're the two skills that have been highlighted there in the report, and that we're hearing from our employers on a daily basis. So, the other thing I think I'd like to point out is that 61% of organisations, according to the report, say they're not agile enough, and they can't pivot to move as Julia, you mentioned hot skills to where those hot skills are needed. So absolutely, we're hearing those kind of messages from all our organisations we talk to, and it could become a big issue for the future.
Anthony, what else does the report tell us about skill shortages then?
Well, I have to say I was very surprised by some of the data that we collected, because you would expect there to be a reduction in the challenges that organisations were having when they recruited people, when there are so many people available in the workforce. In theory, in economic theory, your skill shortages should reduce when the supply of talent has increased. And that is not happening during this recession. And I think part of that is because this recession, this economic fallout from the pandemic, is affecting different parts of the economy and different parts of the workforce very, very differently. So from a sector point of view, we know that hospitality and tourism are in real trouble. Those are sectors that we can reasonably describe as shut down sectors, because their customers have entirely dried up. So there's some sectors that are suffering a lot more than others, where sectors such as healthcare and digital are actually enabling organisations. From a healthcare perspective, they obviously play a crucial role in the pandemic. From a digital point of view, they're enabling so many of us to continue working. So the pandemic is not affecting everybody in the same way. But interestingly, it is also not affecting the workforce in an even way. And there's some research produced by the Resolution Foundation actually quite early on in the pandemic that found that 1/3 of lower paid workers were either made redundant or furloughed, compared to only 1 in 10 higher paid workers. So this is not, the economic fallout from the pandemic is very unevenly spread. Which means that actually this pool of talent that you would expect to be filling all these skill shortages doesn't have the skills that organisations need.
Are there any reasons to be cheerful in this report? I'm thinking specifically about organisations and their continued commitment to learning and development, for example.
Usage of Open Learn, our free platform, during lockdown soared. And by tenfold really, actually. And courses like effective communication in the workplace were really hot courses that learners were taking on. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic. I think there is organisations should invest now for the future, because ultimately if they come out post pandemic, if they're not ready and to take that market opportunity as it arrives, they're going to be in real trouble. So I think it's time to invest now and to think about the longer term.
Is IBM putting more focus on learning and development as a result of lockdown?
In my experience, absolutely, yes. I think we've always thought that employees are a company's biggest asset, and working with an organisation that's in such a fast-moving, changing industry, that it's vital to keep your employees developing professionally and building the skills that they're going to need to succeed themselves, and build the skill set in the new hot areas that the market's moving in. And in doing so, it brings innovation into the workforce, and into your company offerings. It's vital really to grow your talent, to retain your talent, and when companies invest in their CPD for their employees, then their employee engagement improves, performance improves, and then clearly it has there's a link to corporate performance then at that level as well. So so I've seen very much so with IBM, and actually going back to what Anthony was saying about it's not just about the digital skills, it's about the leadership and management skills, the problem solving, being creative with the new situations that you find yourself in. And resiliency has been a big push with IBM, because all of a sudden the whole workforce is working alone, and the whole mental health piece is really important. And it's vital for employees to be able to stay in contact with each other, for managers to be able to motivate and engage a team remotely. So there's a whole lot of reskilling that's being done, and not just on our in our industry solutions areas really.
That the government have been talking about skills in the heart of everything they've been saying for the last few months, and that I think is an important message that employers need to take on board, because I think it is about building skills. And if we are going to come back as an economy and back as a country and back as organisations being profitable, you need to invest in your skills. So it's hugely important.
Yeah.
And Maria, can I just bring you in for a kind of smaller business view on skills development? How have you been able to develop skills through this period?
Well, learning and development has always been a key part of Mesomorphic's culture. We are always encouraging the whole team to identify any areas they want to explore and to build and develop on. So we're actually very lucky that we've managed to receive some support from Hans Nines Enterprise, who have put aside a training fund for us. So we're getting some money towards our funding. And as a company, we will sit down and sort of work out, are there any areas that we need to look at, whether that be a skills, sort of like studying on a specific language, for example, or whether there's a marketing skills gap. So I myself actually took part in a course through the Robert Gordon's University at the start of lockdown, which is focusing on that strategic digital marketing, because I knew that wasn't an area that I felt particularly confident in. So I went out and participated in that course.
That's great. So for the final part of this first look at the takeaways from the Business Barometer report, I'd just like to look at the role of apprenticeships and their impact in the recovery. So Anthony, could I just start by asking you what the report tells us about apprenticeships and how they're helping organisations recover?
Well, I mean, it's a kind of good news, bad news story. So I'll start with bad news. So the bad news is that, apprenticeship numbers have been cut. You've seen organisations either furloughing their apprentices or making their apprentices redundant, huge increases in apprentice redundancies, and a huge drop in apprenticeship starts, most notably in smaller organisations. So that's the bad news. There's also, employers saying, actually, we're dealing with so much uncertainty at the moment, we just cannot make the commitment necessary for an apprenticeship. And as we know, an apprenticeship is a minimum commitment of 12 months and a 20% off the job training requirement, in addition to the resources that an organisation invests in training an apprentice on site. So there is definite pushback on having to take an apprentice in these times of immense or massive uncertainty. So that's the bad news. Now the good news is that organisations are saying, actually, apprenticeships are going to play a key role in our recovery process, and nearly 6 in 10 organisations say that they expect to be hiring more apprentices in the next 12 months. So I think it is a story of two halves. That there is an immediate response to the crisis, but actually organisations recognising that apprenticeships play a key role in their recovery process. Just one other thing that I think is just worth mentioning that the report highlights is that some sectors significantly place real value on the role apprenticeships will play in the future. And so, their sectors, including the pharmaceutical sector, healthcare and digital sectors, are all saying apprenticeships will play a clear role in our recovery process. So, a demonstration not just of those sector, the growth prospects of those sectors, but also of the demonstrable value that apprenticeships provide those particular organisations in those sectors. So, I think there's some really good news here for apprenticeships. Just today, at the moment, it's just not looking so good.
Yeah, and Viren, is that reflected in the conversations you're having with employers?
Absolutely, I think that is absolutely reflective of what we're hearing from our employers, and in fact, what they're saying is that they're waiting to see what the external market dynamics are going to turn out to be for them and their organisation. So they are interested in apprenticeships. They see the value of apprenticeships, but they're just going to hold fire for a while until that uncertainty disappears or goes away, and they get more visibility of what the future holds. But they do see this as a key part of it. Key part of their kind of recovery. And I think the OU is sort of the largest sort of degree apprenticeship provider in the country at the moment, and we are hearing that on a daily basis. And I think albeit it's different for different sectors, as Anthony has mentioned, in certain areas where they're a lot stronger in healthcare, and we are a strong player in the healthcare market, where in retail, in other areas it is the whole market's been decimated. So I think you're right. I think it's a game of two halves. I think it's about taking stock, but we're definitely hearing those the same messages coming through from the conversations we're having.
Yeah, and Maria, how is it for you?
Well, we have 2 graduate apprentices, on our team, and I agree completely with what Anthony was saying earlier about there is a large investment especially for an SME, I myself have taken on the mentor role for both graduates, and it does take up a lot of time. However, at the same time, from my point of view, it's actually been an interesting learning experience for myself. It's giving me that opportunity to practice my managerial skills, practice my leadership skills, and grow in that area as well. So when it comes to the apprenticeships, we're very lucky that we've got a strong relationship with the Open University, and we've been able to feed back some of their experiences that they've had through the course and some of my experience through the course back to the Open University, and we've been able to have conversations. So whilst there is a huge time commitment, I really do think that apprenticeships are going to be playing a key role as part of the recovery. And I'm hoping for Mesomorphic especially, that we're going to be able to start taking on more apprenticeships again as of next year.
Great, thank you. And Julia, how's the role of the apprenticeship been in IBM through this period?
It's we love apprentices. Let's put that on the table. They are, it's a really productive and effective talent strategy. Whether that be hiring new apprentices that are out of school, or whether it's working with our current staff to reskill and upskill and using apprenticeships in to be able to retain and grow and reshape our workforce as well. It's something that's we've been doing for quite a while, and it's one of the areas that we work with the Open University within as well. And we're finding that it's a really, it's a program that offers real sustainability in terms of the retention and growth of the people that we're bringing in. Millennials are notorious for job hopping, and what we found is our apprentices tend to stay actually, and we've got fantastic retention rates on apprentices, and they bring in real vitality and energy and new ways of thinking and challenging the status quo, which all organisations need. And it's if in terms of adapting to the pandemic, I mean, if organisations are having to look at bringing in looking to refocus their skill sets to align with their business direction, then what an easy way to do it is via apprenticeships. It's an instant option.
I wonder whether the pandemic and kind of that pursuit for value for money will mean that apprenticeships are renewed, and that actually all organisations do exactly what you say, Julia, in terms of using apprenticeships as a way to build their talent pipeline, cost effectively, because that's going to be the order of business for the next 3, 5, 7 years. And I think there is a large group of fantastic businesses that already recognise the value that apprenticeships can provide, and I suspect that what the economic conditions are going to do is encourage more businesses to look at apprenticeships to build that long-term talent pipeline and those leaders of the future, because I think a lot of organisations are not going to be able to afford to kind of just hire the talent they want from the labour force or the labour market, because they won't be able to afford to, and they'll have to build their own talent, and they'll have to get better value for money through the improved retention and commitment that apprentices have to organisations, as you say, Julia.
Yeah, and also as Maria was saying, it's not just about the apprentices. There's it can really help with employee engagement. It can help with employee development as well, in terms of mentoring and coaching and the apprentices as they come into the organisation. So it's a win-win really.
Absolutely. I think we've got 7 apprentices in my team, and they bring a different kind of energy, and they kind of it's interesting. Prior to the apprentices arriving and where we are now, that energy is amazing. I mean, they bring a slightly different outlook. They bring that energy. They bring that exuberance of youth, which is really good for an organisation that potentially has an older workforce, and they bring a different point of view of life. And that, I think, adds real value. Not just in the business sense, but actually in a sense that you're bringing the teams together, and it's a more cohesive team because you've got a range of individuals from different ages bringing different things to the party.
I think it's also about when you create a learning organisation, it creates a new dynamic. What you were saying, Maria, about how your mentoring of the apprentices, you felt that's developed your management capability. I always think that's the kind of the hidden benefit of apprenticeships that we don't talk about enough. It's not just about the individual doing the apprenticeship, the apprentice themselves that gets value from the apprenticeship. It's actually the whole team around them, and it's that creating a team that is constantly learning. And I don't think I'm a big advocate for apprenticeships across the workforce and across the age range. I don't think apprenticeships are just about young people. I think it's also about older people in your organisation developing new skills, because we're going to need to do that, because the world is just going to get faster and faster and more uncertain. And so we're going to need to be developing skills. But I think when you get that learning culture within a business, I think it has this hugely transformative impact on teams and how they can cope in any situation. And so I think and so I'm hopeful that the pandemic is going to move us towards these principles of lifelong learning that we've talked about for a long time, but maybe it's taken a global pandemic for us to get to that point where we're actually saying this is important and we need to get on with it.
Exactly. I mean, we have seen up in Shetland, when I've been having conversations with other business owners, that apprenticeships are now, they've always been there on the table, but they are now starting to become more widely spoken about, especially around the graduate apprenticeship schemes. One thing I find particularly interesting is with both our graduates apprentices is that what they're learning is not just learning the skills, so say software development, but they're also learning about other parts of the company. So we've had conversations about GDPR, different conversations about the finances. So it's actually given me the opportunity as well to sort of review our processes and go, oh, actually, I didn't realise that, or that's really interesting, let's try that. And it's a continuous, it's an iterative approach.
I was going to ask you, but this is an aside really. I mean, do you think, it sounds very positive for apprenticeships. Do you think this is the kind of, could this really prompt a lot more focus on apprenticeships in the UK? I mean, I don't know, because they've always, we're not Germany, but are we going to be moving to something where there's a lot more emphasis on this as a form of sustainable skills development?
Do you know, I'm actually very optimistic. I think when you look at the initial data, the initial data is really depressing. It just says, and our data is better than the national picture. If you look at the data from Department for Education, I think apprenticeship starts, Vera, you'd know this better than me, I think they're down 80%. Sorry. Yeah, 80%. I mean, and I have spoken to training providers in the digital sector who are saying they're down 85%. So, it is really, really tough there if you are, at this precise moment in time. But I think it's where we are now is not where we're going to be in 6 months' time. People, while we are in this uncertain place, I think people are just getting more comfortable in working in an environment of absolute uncertainty. And the moment you start getting comfortable with uncertainty, you actually start returning to normal. And so I think there's going to be an inflection point soon where people go, we can't afford to recruit the best people or kind of send people on really expensive training. So what we're going to do is we're going to build our own talent from the ground up, whether they're existing people in our workforce or new people. And so I think we're going to, I think that's going to be really, really positive.
I think it's also still important to remember that schools are still quite geared towards that. You go to school, you go to college, you go to uni, you're done. And we are now starting to see those conversations starting. So as those conversations happen more in schools, we are going to see more apprenticeships coming through. Because I know some of the work that we've been doing, we've got parents coming up to us at careers days going, what's an apprenticeship in software development? What's that all about? And by this point, their child is in S5, S6, and they're still not having those conversations about these opportunities are available for you. Now that might be on the schools, and that's also on the employers as well, to say, right, these are the opportunities that are there for you. Have a discussion with us, see if there's something there, rather than necessarily going south to the mainland.
I'd now like to move on to the second part of today's webinar. We're going to look at how employers can support skills development in their organisations. Viren, can I start by asking you how business leaders, regardless of the size of their organisation, can ensure that skills development continues to be recognised as having a value?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for me, it's about the cost of buying in talent. It's hugely expensive now to buy in talent. So if you're not developing your own staff and reskilling them and moving them into the cold spots or hot spots that we've talked about earlier on, it's going to be really expensive for you as an organisation to bring that talent into the work for you. So, I think we've had a previous report, in this report, it says that 3 in 5 businesses say they're not agile enough because of skills shortages. Well, that's because they're not building their own and growing their own talent. We've had a previous report called Leading Digital Age that 3/4 of leaders say they benefit from more training and to keep up with digital change. So lifelong learning is really important, and I think we have to get through to business leaders that it's lifelong learning. It's about building your own talent, growing your own talent pipeline to make sure that you are absolutely able to meet the challenges that the next 5-10 years will throw at you, and that's the really important piece. So it may be, it's not a cost argument for me. It's more about actually making sure that you're fit and future proofing yourself for the future.
And Maria, what does your leadership do to promote the value of skills development?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, learning and development and skills development is a core part of Mesomorphic's culture. Yeah. So it's always encouraged to identify different areas where you feel like you might want to explore. And also what we tend to do in Mesomorphic is, when you're employed as, say, a software developer, for example, as an SME, generally you find that you're wearing a lot of hats. So you can be employed as, we'll just say again for the software development, but you could end up potentially doing something in finance. You could be getting more involved in analysing VAT reports or something like that. And we'll give you the opportunities there to support myself in doing that role. And that's an opportunity for me to act as a mentor, which, I think mentoring is a fantastic way to develop your own skills, because you're talking to somebody about your process and they're giving the opportunity to reflect as well. So I think that's a great opportunity. And as I mentioned before, we will block off time in diaries. And we don't necessarily say you have to complete 40 hours a year, simply because with an SME, time and resources are a key factor. And taking somebody off a project to do that skills development, yes, there's so much value in doing that, but it's also a fine balance of how to keep your projects moving forward as well. So that's something we have to sort of keep in mind. I think also as a leader, and something I think that upon reflection, something I need to do a bit more of is making sure that skills auditing is done at set points throughout the year. So rather than doing it, say, once or twice a year and say, have you thought about this, or where would you like to improve? We actually sit and work through the audit, say, okay, well, we thought about this, and this is the spin-off result from that. Is there anything in there that you can have a look at as well?
Great. So I understand for both IBM and Mesomorphic, skills development is seen as also something a lot more valuable to the community, so in the sense of corporate responsibility. So Julia, could you tell us a bit about how that works at IBM?
Yes, it's a key part of our corporate strategy, is to support, I guess it's good technology and having responsible stewardship of that technology, and part of that is to support I guess a more inclusive society by investing in skills and reskilling within the digital era. And there are a whole plethora of projects going on, including I guess the program that I'm working on right now, which is the Skills Build Reignite platform, which is an open platform for anybody who's seeking work, maybe has been impacted by the pandemic, that has maybe is an entrepreneur or a small business owner to go to for if they're looking for the latest new skills, digital skills, business skills, strategy, I guess new ways of working, and there's financial advice, there's legal education, and in order to be able to, I guess, adapt to the current environment that they're facing. And IBM aren't doing this alone. Obviously, we're working with the Open University and an ecosystem of partners who to tap into their own talent networks and also their own offerings in order to be able to offer this out really quickly and have an immediate impact on the world in which we live. And so, with the Open University, we're working with their Open Learn offerings, and when I first got talking to the Open University, it was very much a meeting of minds, and I think two organisations have always been focused on accessible learning and already I guess and skills for all, and both organisations are set up to be able to offer online digital learning globally, as well as having a big presence, locally in the UK to be able to address those local marketplaces. So it was actually very easy to identify, what's we both had I guess a focus on supporting the UK economy to rebuild, and we found a way of working with the Open University was to look at, okay, so where can the Open University support us in terms of the focuses that we had, and the Open Learn platform was the natural progression there. And so the other thing is as well, so there's the access to these to this learning support, but there's also we don't just leave it there. We're working particularly to focus on giving one-to-one support as well, coaching and advisory services for those who need it as well. So it's something I think IBM sees, and I maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but the OU sees as well, as that together and with our ecosystem partners, when larger businesses and organisations come together to support the smaller businesses, entrepreneurs, job seekers, then together we'll be able to move the economy forwards far faster than if we were to go it alone, and by sharing our skill set.
Great. So that skills remit pushes way beyond the boundaries of the organisation. So you're doing a whole range of initiatives to engage people around skills who aren't necessarily only in the organisation. So that's great. Thank you, Julia. So Maria, how does that work for Mesomorphic? How's the skills development agenda kind of seeping out from the organisation, if you like?
Well, given our geographical location, we do have a slightly different challenge, I think, is what companies have on the mainland. As we've seen in the report, there's this talk about battle for talent. In order for us to get to reach our mission, I guess, or to achieve our vision of being the company that puts Shetland on the map for digital development, we're really focusing on growing our homegrown talent. And the way that we've done this, we've actually created an engagement pipeline that starts in primary school and supports both teachers and students all the way up through to graduate level.
Just what Maria's saying, I think it's really important to say the critical role that smaller organisations have in local communities. There was a report published by the Federation of Small Businesses called Small Business Big Heart, which was all about the role of small businesses in their local communities, and not just focused on their their business priorities, but actually very, very aware of the impact that they have on their local community. And what you were saying just then, Maria, about having this very, very positive impact on the wider community, and how you're developing a wider skill set, and the reach of the organisation is much further than just the day-to-day business activities of the business. I think it just reminded me of what that report said, and just this crucial role of small businesses. And the reason why I think it is important in this context of our kind of current challenges across the country is that actually small businesses have a crucial role in the rebuild process.
Yeah,
I also feel that from an SME's point of view, it's also crucial for us to all sort of start collaborating as well and networking together, because as we mentioned earlier, as an SME, often in the roles you find it wearing multiple hats. Now, if you're collaborating with another SME, there's a potential for maybe a sort of a work experience placement in another role, so you're getting more immersed in that in that environment. But as with everything, it's time and resources, so it really is a juggling act of working at the right time and the right areas to focus on which skills to work on as well. So
well, I think especially with across the whole challenges with skills. I think the number one challenge for small businesses recruiting apprentices are finding the apprentices in the first place. So finding the talent, and yet larger organisations, and I'm not sure if this is the case with IBM, but they have huge numbers of applicants and many more people than they can hire. And I just think just in that alone, there's a really interesting opportunity to connect that surplus of candidates with larger organisations with maybe the challenges that smaller businesses have, just getting enough people to apply for the jobs. And I wonder if there's an opportunity there for just in that area, and the other I think is work experience. I think there's loads of small businesses that want to do exactly what you're doing, Maria, and offering work experience to local young people in schools, but they just don't know how to connect. And it feels like actually small businesses working together could be much more effective, kind of reaching out to the local schools and finding people to do work experience, because when you're an individual business, you have to be really, really committed to doing work experience, because there's so much work to do. If you could spread that work over your peers within the small business community, it just becomes that much easier.
Just to pick up on a point you mentioned there about the recruitment, one thing I wasn't overly aware of until recently was that a lot of the people who are providing apprenticeships across the board will actually help with recruitment as well, which, as someone in our point of view, is so valuable. It's unbelievable, because yes, we can go out and yes, we can engage, but also recruitment does take up a huge amount of time. So if there are people who are interested in apprenticeships and they come towards us, that's great. That cuts out a lot of time. However, as you say, if there are recruiters out there who will go out and find people for your company, that does help quite a lot as well.
Something that IBM's done that's I've just thought of that is very relevant is last year we spotted that exactly what you were saying, Marie. It's really, smaller organisations find it really difficult to find, the breadth of talent that IBM can find, for example, because we are inundated with applications. So what we did is we piloted a new programme to bring on apprentices with the sole purpose of skilling them up and then placing them into our partner ecosystem. So we're providing them with that. I guess we're accessing the talent in the first place. We're providing them with the skill set to get to a flying start within our partner channels, and then they were completing their apprenticeship within that small business or smaller business, and then had the opportunity then to work full time for that organisation. So it's like coming back to you before, you've got to be creative, and this is about large organisations playing their part in supporting the rest of the ecosystem. So
I wanted to just bring this back to some of the challenges that were outlined in the report. Many organisations are facing difficult decisions around having to make cutbacks in the workforce in order to survive. But where does taking those cutbacks leave them if they have skills deficits elsewhere? Viren, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, Martin, I don't think it's a debate between redundancies on cutting back and reskilling. I think it's really the debate should be about how can organisations repurpose and retrain their staff for those areas that they are lacking in skills. I'm a great example of that. I think I started my career off as a qualified accountant. I'm a qualified accountant. I'm now moved into the commercial world, and if it wasn't for those learning opportunities that my previous employers gave me, I wouldn't be in the position that I am now. And it's about moving that talent to the right places. And I think, the debate has always been about should I reskill or should I make people redundant? Well, actually, I think you should be reskilling and moving those people to areas where you think you're lacking. And lifelong learning has to come along with that, to give them the opportunity to learn those new skills, to be able to develop and, have multiple careers within the same organisation. We talked about millennials moving quite quickly. Well, actually, if you can give a millennial, I can't even say that word now, the opportunity to work in the same organisation with multiple careers, that's really important. And I think if we can do that, it will help us. And I think, we spend £1.2 billion last year on temporary staff. Is there an opportunity for us to repurpose that, to retrain staff in areas that we feel are lacking? So I think the debate should move from redundancies to actually, how can we repurpose staff? How can we repurpose that spend on temporary staff to our benefit?
And I want to pick up on that point with both you and Anthony around how can HR directors make the case for the protection of training budgets when they're facing so many other pressures as a result of the pandemic, like the ones you've just been talking about? Anthony.
Well, I mean, this is a super hard question, because when a business experiences a massive economic shock, whether it's a pandemic or financial crisis or whatever other crisis that a business might face, the financial director, the chief financial officer, has to act quickly and decisively in order to give their organisation the best chances of survival. And very, very often, the first thing that they cut back on are people. And that has huge consequences to individuals and to society. But it is organisations taking a longer term view of their survival in order to give them the best chances to get through whatever crisis that they're thrown at. And I think this crisis has been slightly different, because the crisis hit, and then the Chancellor stepped in and introduced the job retention scheme, and that stopped lots of financial directors and CFOs making that very deep cut that they would have otherwise made to their headcount. Not that lots of them didn't make redundancies, but it was far less than if the job retention scheme hadn't been introduced. So the challenge is that chief financial officers and financial directors are doing this because they've got the best interest, the long-term interests of the company in mind, and this is how they cope with the crisis. Now, I think that we're entering into kind of new economic conditions and new competitive conditions for businesses, because coming out of any crisis, it requires investment. It requires investment for your organisation to do things differently. And I think there are three elements to that. One is the availability of money, and actually the availability of money is money is relatively easy to get. So the government's made huge amounts of finance available to businesses, which has meant that raising capital isn't as difficult as it would be in a normal recession. It's difficult, but not as difficult as it would normally be. So that's the first hurdle. The second hurdle is around technology, and technology is now more affordable and more available than it's ever been before. And the statistic that I always like to quote is the fact that 10 years ago, if you wanted to build a technology platform, it would have cost you £3 million, and today it costs you £3,000, just because technology is that much more available, and platforms are available, and in fact there are no coding applications that you can use to write programs for your business where you don't need any coding skills at all. So the availability of technology is more available now than it's ever been before. And so the one piece of the jigsaw puzzle that is still in short supply is skills. You know, you've got the money, you've got the technology, but you need the skills. And that's the area where there's real short supply. And I think this is the heart of the challenge with the negotiations that an HR director needs to have with the finance director. And not forgetting that within a small business, those two roles might be the same person. But the challenge is, you know, how do, you know, in this future that we need to map for ourselves and the investments we need to make, we know there's a supply of funding. We know that the technology is available, but the skills are the thing that are in short supply, and the skills are the thing that the skills are the part of the jigsaw puzzle that we need to have if we're going to be able to navigate out of this crisis. So I think it is, you know, it's a huge challenge because businesses are making these cuts because they have to out of their own survival. But I think if they are going to invest their way out of this crisis, then the one stumbling block and the one thing they have to focus on is skills development. And so that's what, you know, that's the heart of this particular issue, I think.
Yeah, and I think you know, being a former CFO myself, you know, I think for me it was the opportunity cost of not training. You know, if you do not train your staff, you know, you spend money elsewhere in buying in staff. And I think, you know, there's the stats out there that we spend £6.6 billion on buying in ready-made skills. You know, that is a huge expense for the economy, for organisations. And I think, you know, if you can have that longer term view, as Anthony's mentioned, you know, and, you know, there is always a desire to learn new skills. There's always been a desire for people to have lifelong learning opportunities. The desire is there. We need to get, you know, HR directors to be able to talk to CFOs and finance directors and have that conversation, because, you know, that conversation it needs to be had on a daily basis about, you know, the opportunity cost of not investing in staff and not training, because, you know, it will cost you more in the longer run.
We're now going to have our Q&A session in which we will answer some of the questions we've received from our audience. Our first is from Ollie Newton at the Edge Foundation, who asks, I'd love to ask the panel to get their crystal balls out and see what they think some of the emerging trends might be next year, given the impact of COVID-19.
Yeah, I think it goes back to our previous question around sort of redundancy versus reskilling. I think we're going to see a theme next year in the coming years post-COVID around sort of had people having multiple careers and having multiple skill sets within the same organisation because they needed to do different things. And this pandemic has really, you know, brought the best out of us in terms of everyone pulling together as a society, but also in organisations to help each other out. So I think you'll see a lot more of a generalist type approach rather than a technical expert. And you'll see, and I think that will help with, you know, that goes to place to what Maria was saying just now around, you'll see more SMEs picking up, because these individuals will go, well, actually, I have a skill set here and I want to build a business which actually does that. And they'll extend that reach and become uncomfortable, I think, being sort of comfortable, I suppose, in that sense. And I think that's the important piece. I think you'll see a theme around that.
And Julia, what kind of trends do you see emerging over the coming year?
I think businesses, having learnt their lessons almost of the experience that they've had this year, are going to have to become more agile, more resilient, and respond to changes far more effectively.
I'd like to just ask one more question to bring this Q&A to an end, and that is around diversity. The report shows there's an increasing appetite to focus on diversity and improve it in organisations. But where does that sit with the focus on skills and putting money and investment into that? Julia, what are your thoughts on that?
There's two approaches I can talk to you about. So within IBM, you know, we've recognised the value of having a diverse workforce ever since day one. It's been part of our DNA, if you like, and you know, we recognise that it brings the innovation. It recognises it brings different ideas, and the world out there is not the same shape and size. And our organisation needs to have employees that represent the wider communities as a whole. And we've put a lot of work into this in terms of working right at the start of our organisation, at the lower levels of organisation, working with charities and non-profit organisations to provide work experience and training to their disadvantaged young people or communities which would really benefit from having a foot up. There's and it opens people's eyes into up to the world of work, and the fact that they are perfectly capable of joining an organisation like IBM. You've got apprenticeships, which are fantastic for social mobility, and it's particularly not everybody can afford to go to university, for example. So that's where your degree apprenticeships come in, if nothing else. But also thinking about the Skills Build Reignite programme in the UK specifically, they have a very big focus on working with social enterprises, BAME-led and female-led businesses, because recognising that these types of organisations are the future of our economy going forward. They're the ones that will bring about changes, and but maybe disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So that's a focus for us in the UK specifically.
Great, thank you. And Anthony, are there any other insights that you'd like to share from the report around diversity?
Yeah, I mean, without shadow of a doubt, the death of George Floyd in May had a huge impact, renewed the focus on the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think it led many organisations to reassess their equal opportunities policies to make sure that they weren't just a policy, but there was some real and meaningful action that sat behind it. As has been said, the report highlights a large number of organisations now very, very focused on improving their diversity. In fact, 2/3 of senior leaders said they're actively looking to hire candidates from diverse backgrounds. So, a real focus on the importance of diversity. And I think the driver is that, more diverse organisations are just better organisations. They're better businesses. They perform better. They are able to deliver better results. And so I think the focus is on getting to that point of actually recognising that organisations have to do more if they want to be the best version of themselves. And so I think that's what really comes out of the report.
That brings our discussion to a close. Thanks to the panel for all your thought-provoking contributions. The Business Barometer is out now and includes further insights and views from our panel and can be downloaded from the Open University's website. A link is shown on screen. Thank you to everyone who has joined us online. And if you would like to get in contact with the team at the Open University to discuss the report or your skills challenges, you can email business@open.ac.uk. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar.